Chapter 56 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 56. Ralph Nickleby, baffled by his nephew in his late design, hatches a scheme of retaliation which accident suggests to him, and takes into his counsels a tried auxiliary. The course which these adventures shape out for themselves, and imperatively call upon the historian to observe, now demands that they should revert to the point they attained previously to the commencement of the last chapter, when Ralph Nickleby and Arthur Gride were left together in the house where death had so suddenly reared his dark and heavy banner. With clenched hands and teeth ground together so firm and tight that no locking of the jaws could have fixed and riveted them more securely, Ralph stood, for some minutes, in the attitude in which he had last addressed his nephew, breathing heavily, but as rigid and motionless in other respects as if he had been a brazen statue. After a time he began, by slow degrees, as a man rousing himself from heavy slumber, to relax. For a moment he shook his clasped fist towards the door by which Nicholas had disappeared, and then, thrusting it into his breast, as if to repress by force even this show of passion, turned round and confronted the less hardy usurer, who had not yet risen from the ground. The cowering wretch, who still shook in every limb, and whose few grey hairs trembled and quivered on his head with abject dismay, tottered to his feet as he met Ralph's eye, and, shielding his face with both hands, protested, while he crept towards the door, that it was no fault of his. "Who said it was, man?" returned Ralph in a suppressed voice. "Who said it was?" "You looked as if you thought I was to blame," said Gride timidly. "Pshaw!" Ralph muttered, forcing a laugh. "I blame him for not living an hour longer. 1 hour longer would have been long enough. I blame no one else." No one else?" said Gride. "Not for this mischance," replied Ralph. "I have an old score to clear with that young fellow who has carried off your mistress, but that has nothing to do with his blustering just now, for we should soon have been quit of him but for this cursed accident." There was something so unnatural in the calmness with which Ralph Nickleby spoke, when coupled with his face, the expression of the features to which every nerve and muscle as it twitched and throbbed with a spasm whose workings no effort could conceal, gave every instant some new and frightful aspect. There was something so unnatural and ghastly in the contrast between his harsh, slow, steady voice, only altered by a certain halting of the breath, which made him pause between almost every word like a drunken man bent upon speaking plainly, and these evidences of the most intense and violent passion, and the struggle he made to keep them under, that if the dead body which lay above had stood, instead of him, before the cowering Gride, it could scarcely have presented a spectacle which would have terrified him more. "The coach," said Ralph, after a time, during which he had struggled like some strong man against a fit. "We came in a coach. Is it waiting?" Gride gladly availed himself of the pretext for going to the window to see. Ralph, keeping his face steadily the other way, tore at his shirt with the hand which he had thrust into his breast, and muttered in a hoarse whisper. £10,000, he said, 10,000, the precise sum paid in but yesterday for the 2 mortgages, and which would have gone out again at heavy interest to-morrow. If that house has failed, and he the first to bring the news. Is the coach there? Yes, yes, said Gride, startled by the fierce tone of the inquiry. It's here. Dear, dear, what a fiery man you are. Come here, said Ralph, beckoning to him. We mustn't make a show of being disturbed. We'll go down arm in arm. But you pinch me black and blue, urged Gride. Ralph let him go impatiently, and descending the stairs with his usual firm and heavy tread, got into the coach. Arthur Gride followed. After looking doubtfully at Ralph when the man asked where he was to drive, and finding that he remained silent and expressed no wish upon the subject, Arthur mentioned his own house, and thither they proceeded. On their way, Ralph sat in the furthest corner with folded arms, and uttered not a word. With his chin sunk upon his breast, and his downcast eyes quite hidden by the contraction of his knotted brows, he might have been asleep for any sign of consciousness he gave until the coach stopped, when he raised his head, and glancing through the window, inquired what place that was. My house, answered the disconsolate Gride, affected perhaps by its loneliness. Oh dear, my house. "True," said Ralph. "I have not observed the way we came. I should like a glass of water. You have that in the house, I suppose?" "You shall have a glass of anything you like," answered Gride with a groan. "It's no use knocking, coachman. Ring the bell." The man rang, and rang, and rang again; then knocked until the street re-echoed with the sounds; then listened at the keyhole of the door. Nobody came. The house was silent as the grave. "How's this?" said Ralph impatiently. "Peg is so very deaf," answered Gride with a look of anxiety and alarm. "Oh dear! Ring again, coachman. She sees the bell." Again the man rang, and knocked, and knocked, and rang again. Some of the neighbours threw up their windows and called across the street to each other that old Gride's housekeeper must have dropped down dead. Others collected round the coach and gave vent to various surmises. Some held that she had fallen asleep; some that she had burnt herself to death; some that she had got drunk; and one very fat man that she had seen something to eat which had frightened her so much, not being used to it, that she had fallen into a fit. This last suggestion particularly delighted the bystanders, who cheered it rather uproariously, and were with some difficulty deterred from dropping down the area and breaking open the kitchen door to ascertain the fact. Nor was this all. Rumours having gone abroad that Arthur was to be married that morning, very particular inquiries were made after the bride, who was held by the majority to be disguised in the person of Mr. Ralph Nickleby, which gave rise to much jocose indignation at the public appearance of a bride in boots and pantaloons, and called forth a great many hoots and groans. At length the two moneylenders obtained shelter in a house next door, and, being accommodated with a ladder, clambered over the wall of the back yard, which was not a high one, and descended in safety on the other side. "I am almost afraid to go in, I declare," said Arthur, turning to Ralph when they were alone. "Suppose she should be murdered, lying with her brains knocked out by a poker, eh?" "Suppose she were," said Ralph. "I tell you, I wish such things were more common than they are, and more easily done. You may stare and shiver. I do." He applied himself to a pump in the yard, and having taken a deep draught of water and flung a quantity on his head and face, regained his accustomed manner, and led the way into the house, Gride following close at his heels. It was the same dark place as ever; every room dismal and silent as it was wont to be, and every ghostly article of furniture in its customary place. The iron heart of the grim old clock, undisturbed by all the noise without, still beat heavily within its dusty case. The tottering presses slunk from the sight as usual in their melancholy corners. The echoes of footsteps returned the same dreary sound. The long-legged spider paused in his nimble run, and, scared by the sight of men in that his dull domain, hung motionless on the wall, counterfeiting death until they should have passed him by. From cellar to garret went the two usurers, opening every creaking door and looking into every deserted room, but no Peg was there. At last they sat them down in the apartment which Arthur Gride usually inhabited, to rest after their search. "The hag is out on some preparation for your wedding festivities, I suppose," said Ralph, preparing to depart. "See here, I destroy the bond. We shall never need it now." Gride, who had been peering narrowly about the room, fell at that moment upon his knees before a large chest, and uttered a terrible yell. "How now?" said Ralph, looking sternly round. "Robbed! Robbed!" screamed Arthur Gride. "Robbed? Of money?" "No, no, no. Worse. Far worse." "Of what then?" demanded Ralph. "Worse than money, worse than money!" cried the old man, casting the papers out of the chest like some beast tearing up the earth. "She had better have stolen money. All my money. I haven't much. She had better have made me a beggar than have done this." "Done what?" said Ralph. "Done what, you devil's dotard?" Still Gride made no answer, but tore and scratched among the papers, and yelled and screeched like a fiend in torment. "There is something missing, you say," said Ralph, shaking him furiously by the collar. "What is it?" "Papers, deeds. I am a ruined man. Lost, loss. I am robbed. I am ruined. She saw me reading it of late. I did very often. She watched me, saw me put it in the box that fitted into this. The box is gone. She has stolen it. Damnation seize her, she has robbed me." "Of what?" cried Ralph, on whom a sudden light appeared to break, for his eyes flashed and his frame trembled with agitation as he clutched Gride by his bony arm. "Of what?" "She don't know what it is. She can't read," shrieked Gride, not heeding the inquiry. "There's only one way in which money can be made of it, and that is by taking it to her. Somebody will read it for her and tell her what to do. She and her accomplice will get money for it, and be let off besides. They'll make a merit of it, say they found it, knew it, and be evidence against me. The only person it will fall upon is me, me, me.